Welcome back, my friends, to the show that absolutely did end about 2 years ago. After 6 years of extensive and extended travels, that all came to a screeching halt in 2020 for pretty obvious reasons. I've had a bunch of adventures the last few years, carded in the upper right-hand corner for the most recent, but that stretch post-2020 was the longest I've gone without using my passport in over a decade. So let me tell you, dear friends, on that bus to the airport, I cried. I sniffled and sniffed and cried as quietly as I could. The joy and excitement was just overwhelming. My destination? A country I never expected to visit again. Not for nefarious reasons. I just spent 6 months of the first year and a half of my travel adventures there, and, well, there's a whole world to see. But my friend Grace had moved there, and that was the perfect excuse to start my first international trip in many years. I'd met Grace in Taiwan, and she'd been visiting me in the US in March of, you guessed it, 2020. In fact, her flight home was the last flight allowed into Taiwan before some severe and lengthy quarantines were enacted. Crossing the Pacific takes a long time, 14 hours and 25 minutes in this case. But that wasn't even the end of this transit. That only got me to Sydney. From there, I caught another flight to Brisbane and then a train south to Gold Coast where she lived. One good thing about the pause in my travels, though, is I had plenty of frequent flyer points to get a free business class seat, so I got some sleep at least. The most frustrating part of getting to Gold Coast was actually the domestic terminal at Sydney Airport. Once you land at the international terminal, you have to take a bus that literally leaves the airport and then re-enters it in a different part. And for some reason, the security was some of the worst I'd ever seen. The line stretched out of the check-in area, through a huge tent set up in the parking lot, back into the building, all the while snaking back and forth on itself countless times. Fortunately, I had nothing better to do. My layover was 6 hours. Well, after nearly 30 hours of travel, I finally made it. The place actually looks great. I wasn't sure, since I've kind of been burned on Airbnbs before, that they have some great pictures, but then you end up in a different room in the same building, or yeah, but looks pretty great. That's the ocean. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's even a little balcony, which I think I probably showed a second ago. But yeah, that's my view. I imagine there's going to be a pretty good sunrise here tomorrow. Well, I'm off to find some food and see my friend, and this has been a very long day. So, see you in a bit. Bye. More than anything, I'd say Australia is famous for its wildlife. It has long been a meme that everything there is trying to kill you. There's less truth in that than it seems, but you can't deny Australia has some pretty dangerous-looking animals. Kangaroos that look jacked on steroids, dingoes that look like dogs but kind of stare at you all wrong, and don't get me started on the drop bears. So like the absolute lunatics that they are, Australians often capture some of these animals and put them in sort of free-range zoos where you're allowed to just walk up to them. You can even get hugged by a koala, feed an emu, try to make friends with a wallaby, and more. Fortunately, some of the smaller, shyer, more fragile animals are better protected from the two-legged predator types. A red panda, binturong, some capybaras are all happy to view their captors from a respectable distance. Now, I'm not typically a fan of zoos. The small cages and animals well outside their natural habitat all end up being kind of depressing to me. Fortunately, though, Currumbin Wildlife Sanctuary is better than that. Each animal is well looked after in large enclosures, with lots of food and no predators. Probably not a bad life, considering. Overall, this was going to be a very different trip than my previous Australian adventures. First, I was here primarily just to visit my friend. We both had to work, so a multi-week road trip through the outback wasn't in the cards. I was also here just to be somewhere else. After so many years of extensive travel and then a nearly 3-year break, I was happy to just be on an adventure someplace different. But this was just the start. After Australia, I was going to keep heading west, following the sunset until I arrived back home, just shy of how long it took Phileas Fogg and the Jules Verne Classic. After here, I'd head to Bali, then a short stop in Qatar, before a few weeks in Europe and the UK, then to Iceland, and eventually New Hampshire for some time with my folks and my dad's 80th birthday. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, Grace and I would head out on a short road trip. A few hours north of Brisbane is Rainbow Beach, a cozy little town with a lovely, you guessed it, beach. This was the middle of winter though, and even though Rainbow Beach is at the same latitude in the southern hemisphere that Miami is in the northern, it wasn't exactly beach weather. It wasn't cold either, but we weren't going to be lying out in the sun at all. One of the main points of interest in this area is the Great Sandy National Park, and specifically the Kulula Sand Patch. It's basically just an enormous parabola-shaped sand dune, but undeniably cool looking. From here, we headed southwest. The Border Ranges National Park, west of Brisbane, potentially offered some stunning views of what Australia calls mountains. I wouldn't call them that. The tallest peak in the country is actually lower than what I can just see from my house. But there are some spots that are wonderfully scenic, and we figured it was worth heading there to check them out. However, it turned into a bit of a different adventure than we expected. As we drove our way into the park, I was a little surprised and then increasingly alarmed at the state of the roads. Mediocre pavement gave way to gravel, which gave way to mud. Fog had either descended or we'd driven up into it. I suppose we could have turned around, but I held on to the hope that maybe the peak was poking up above the clouds. How cool would that be? Spoiler, it was not. So we continued up muddier and slipperier roads, and soon I became aware that we hadn't passed or been passed by a car in quite some time. The locals must have been smart enough to avoid this area when it was wet. Still, it was undeniably cool. Visually fascinating in a different way. Jungle foliage looming out of a thick bank of fog and then disappearing behind our increasingly muddy car. Eventually, we made it to the supposed scenic outlook. There was a short walk through the forest to a metal viewing platform, and then, yep, still nothing, just fog. Oh well. As luck would have it, we ran into another tourist who had driven her car up here, and we decided, for both of our safety, to head back down together. With no cell service, dense fog, and no traffic, I figured that the very real possibility of sliding off the road into the fog would be unpleasant. Fortunately, none of that happened. We emerged from the clouds, back into the sun, and headed back to Gold Coast. It had been a wonderful few weeks. I'd eased my way back into travel and enjoyed every minute of the sun rising over the Pacific, spending time with my friend Grace and exploring a part of this country I actually hadn't seen. We spent my last few days in Australia in Brisbane, a city often overlooked in many must-see and to-do lists, and that's a shame. I guess that sleeper status is somewhat understandable given how overshadowed Brisbane is from the more famous Sydney, the admittedly amazing Melbourne, and of course the city farthest from everything, Perth. But I've spent more time here than any other city in Australia, and I love it. It's the perfect size, it's gorgeous in its own right, and a river runs through it. There are several bridges, pedestrian and otherwise, crisscrossing the water, connecting the old feeling downtown with the parks and restaurants of the South Bank. Memories of this place would come along like waves, washing over me at random moments. I've walked along this river numerous times, and like so much of this trip, it all feels different. Part of that is the weather, I suppose, being here in the late winter instead of middle of summer like my previous visits. But really, I think it's just the inexorable pull of time. Some of the buildings had changed. Some of the sidewalks that were new when I was here last now look aged. So do I suppose. I'm older, undeniably larger, but it's more than that. My first visit to this city was the start of something magic. Everything vibrated with the excitement of the new. I'd finally started to figure out what I was doing with this whole long-term travel thing. My second visit, just a few weeks later, was when I had figured out what I'd actually wanted. And what I'd wanted was to spend more time with some of the people I had met. Many of them were down in Byron Bay, just a short distance from Brisbane, and a place of legend in my story for many reasons. A year later, I returned, halfway through another epic Australian adventure, and that first half hadn't gone as I had hoped, perhaps wanting too hard to repeat the previous year. But once again, Brisbane was the turning point. From here, I'd headed north to Hervey Bay and Fraser Island, making new friends that I'd meet up with again farther north for more epic times and cairns. Australia was the perfect place for this return to adventure, something familiar, yet different. A place with so many good memories, bad ones too, of course, but those are fading with time. Not forgotten, just becoming a lesser chapter in the greater story. Thankfully, not the ending. For me, though, it was time to continue west. Northwest, in fact, to Bali. That's in the next video. Please like and subscribe and all that, it helps a bunch. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.